The harsh studio lights of CNN illuminated the calm face of President Ibrahim Traore. On the split-screen broadcast to millions around the world, he sat in his presidential office in Ouagadougou, the Burkina Faso flag behind him. Opposite him in the Washington, D.C. studio were White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt and General Langley, National Security Advisor, their postures sharp, their expressions unreadable. "We'll begin right away," Anderson Cooper said, his voice steady, though his eyes scanned the screen with anticipation. President Traore, some argue that developing nations lack the foundation to contribute meaningfully to global education reform. What is your response? Karoline leaned forward with a confident smile, interrupting before Ibrahim could speak. Anderson, with all due respect, we're speaking with a leader from a country where more than half the population was illiterate just a few years ago. I'm genuinely curious to hear what lessons he thinks he can teach us. A soft ripple of polite amusement echoed from the audience. Ibrahim remained still, unshaken. General Langley shifted slightly his voice, a deep, commanding baritone. Education is not just about classrooms and textbooks. It's about national security. An underdeveloped education system can incubate instability, even extremism, and that affects regional peace. We cannot ignore that risk. Karoline nodded solemnly. Exactly. When a country struggles to provide stable electricity or basic internet access, I question whether they should be standing on a global stage lecturing others. The weight of the studio pressed down. Lights, cameras, and the rising heat of confrontation filled the room. One side, Washington, held political might, military strength, and media control. The other, a lone African leader, silent under fire. Ibrahim Traore may be a promising young president. Karoline continued, her tone sharpening, but promise is not the same as expertise, and certainly not a license to claim global authority on education. A heavy silence followed. Anderson glanced at Traore, who sat motionless, unblinking. He had yet to utter a single word. The moment felt dangerously unbalanced. Anderson finally broke the silence. President Traore Ibrahim inclined his head with quiet composure. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your honesty. His voice was calm, his eyes meeting the camera with unwavering confidence. In that moment the room stilled. The sarcasm, the smirks, the pretense of superiority all faded under the weight of something unexpected. I will respond, he said slowly, but not with emotion. I will respond with facts. Ibrahim Traore held his gaze steady, unmoved by the earlier attacks. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react emotionally. He simply spoke with facts. Mr. Cooper, esteemed viewers, allow me to begin with the most fundamental thing, reality. He gestured gently, and a graph appeared on the screen behind him, bearing the title Burkina Faso Literacy Rate, 2020-2025. The curve spiked dramatically, rising from 29% to 78% in just 3 years. We've nearly tripled our national literacy rate in 3 years, not by magic but by strategy, he said, his voice calm yet commanding. We built nearly 3,000 new schools, integrated digital education in 95% of institutions, and launched 23 technical universities across the country. Karoline let out a dismissive chuckle, leaning forward, as if to interrupt, but Anderson raised a hand to maintain order. Those numbers sound impressive, General Langley interjected, but data can be inflated. Those achievements don't necessarily reflect real systemic stability. Ibrahim nodded, as if he had anticipated the challenge. The next slide appeared the logos of UNESCO, the World Bank, and, most strikingly, the U.S. Department of Education. These are the organizations that verified our data. Including your own government, he said, locking eyes with General Langley. If you believe the numbers are inflated, perhaps you should revisit your own validation protocols. The studio fell momentarily silent. Karoline said nothing. Langley frowned, arms crossed. We achieved all this not because we had money, but because we had vision, Ibrahim continued. When you can't afford computers, you teach with mobile phones. When there are no labs, you build chemistry kits from recycled materials. When teachers are underpaid, you must give them purpose beyond a paycheck. Now Ibrahim's words seem to address not just his opponents, but the entire world. Education is not a privilege of the wealthy. It is a fundamental human right and living proof that brilliance can grow anywhere. Ibrahim didn't hesitate. You want proof? His voice cut like steel. I'll give you proof. With a snap of his fingers, the screen behind him lit up. 3 unmistakable logos exploded onto the display: Harvard, MIT, Stanford. The world worships these institutions as the pinnacle of academic excellence, he said, turning sharply to face Karoline. And yet today, they are learning from us. The silence was deafening. Harvard Business School is studying Burkina Faso's rural education strategy. MIT is implementing our engineering teaching methods for its freshmen. Stanford has submitted a formal request for partnership to replicate our mass digital education model. Not a keystroke echoed in the room. Every journalist froze. Every eye locked onto the screen. I'm not bragging, Ibrahim said, his tone sharpening. I'm presenting facts. The very same third world education you mock your first world institutions are now carefully copying. Documents appeared, stamped, signed, dated. Karoline furrowed her brow. Langley leaned forward to get a better look. Why? Ibrahim pressed. Because with less than 1/50th of the education budget of any American state, we took a country with 29% literacy and turned it into a STEM leader for an entire continent in just 3 years. He paused, not to breathe, but to apply pressure. You call that suspicious, I call it indisputable. Verified by UNESCO, endorsed by the World Bank. And he looked directly at Langley, confirmed by your own U.S. Department of Education. He took a step forward, his voice dropping into something colder, deeper. You may doubt me, but you will not doubt your own institutions. Not a word came from the American side. General Langley leaned forward, his voice calm, but laced with steel. Mr. President, he began, I don't question your country's efforts, but education cannot be isolated from national security. When a system lacks foundational stability, it becomes more than an internal issue. It turns into a potential regional threat. He paused, locking eyes with Ibrahim. The models you mention may be promising, but they are untested in real geopolitical conditions. Frankly, no credible policymaker is looking to Burkina Faso as a reference point. Karoline seized the moment. To be honest, she said, her tone ice cold, I'm still not entirely clear. Where did you go to school, President Traore? Or are you a product of some guerrilla movement that calls itself a university? The word guerrilla dripped with mockery. Some in the audience gasped. Ibrahim didn't flinch. He looked at both of them, not like opponents, but like students in need of a lesson. I expected that question, he said slowly. I prepared not out of insecurity, but because I've faced prejudice before. He turned slightly. The screen behind him lit up with a series of credentials. Bachelor's degree in Civil Engineering, Kwame Nkrumah, University of Science and Technology, Ghana, first-class honors. Master's in Public Administration, Sorbonne University, Paris, full scholarship for academic merit. MBA from the London School of Economics, completed while serving as a military officer. These degrees, Ibrahim said firmly, are not for boasting. They exist to remind you that real education isn't confined to where you think it should come from. Karoline said nothing. Langley shifted in his seat, but Ibrahim wasn't done. I speak French, English, Portuguese, Arabic, and 4 African languages. How many do you speak? Silence. If you need further confirmation, I'm currently a visiting professor at 3 American universities, UC Berkeley, where I teach innovation governance, Columbia University, where I lecture on sustainable development, and Georgetown, where I lead seminars on youth leadership. Photos appeared him teaching, surrounded by packed classrooms of American students. If you need verification, I can provide direct contact numbers for the department heads. The studio was frozen. Karoline's face was blank. Langley looked at Anderson Cooper, who gave only a tight nod. Ibrahim's voice lowered, growing sharper with precision. Education is not about where you study, but how you think. And more importantly, prestige should follow performance, not precede it. He turned back toward Karoline. You revere Harvard, MIT, Stanford like altars of truth. But if a rural school in Burkina Faso produces better engineers than Harvard, that school deserves respect. The tension was almost physical now. Tradition and reputation can maintain systems, Ibrahim continued. But sometimes stability becomes the enemy of innovation. He took a short breath, not to rest, but to strike deeper. True education should produce people who question everything, not just repeat inherited beliefs. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward once more, desperate to reclaim the momentum. Her voice trembled slightly beneath a forced firmness. But let's not get carried away, she said, eyes fixed on Ibrahim. You still lead one of the poorest countries in the world. How can you possibly claim educational superiority over a nation that gave birth to Harvard, MIT, and Stanford? Ibrahim smiled, not mockingly, but with a kind of gentle amusement. Ms. Leavitt, Burkina Faso may be financially constrained, he replied, but our students consistently outperform American students in international math, science, and programming competitions. With a nod, he triggered the screen again. It came alive with images, gold medals, smiling students holding trophies, international academic Olympiad rankings. Last year alone, our students won 47 medals in global academic contests. Our 16-year-old programmers developed apps that were purchased by American tech firms for millions. Karoline's mouth opened, then closed again. Ibrahim didn't wait. Our university graduation rate, he said, raising a brow. 94%, and the U.S. rate. He turned to Karoline but answered himself. 73%. So yes, Ms. Leavitt, our so-called poorly educated students graduate more consistently than yours. The audience was dead silent. Even Anderson Cooper seemed stunned. But more importantly, Ibrahim continued, his voice softening. We teach our children that intelligence has no color, no passport, no salary bracket. That knowledge is to be respected no matter its origin. Karoline stared ahead. The force of his words had knocked the certainty out of her posture. Anderson leaned forward. President Traore, what advice would you give to countries struggling with limited resources? Ibrahim didn't hesitate. Never underestimate the creative power of scarcity, he said. When resources are few, innovation becomes a necessity, not a luxury. Our teachers used cell phones as teaching tools when we couldn't afford computers. They built chemistry labs with recycled materials, and now those very methods are being studied by elite American universities. The weight of the moment was immense. Karoline finally spoke, but her voice had changed, less defensive, more uncertain. Surely, she began, you'd agree that having more resources improves education. Of course, Ibrahim replied calmly, but resources without vision are wasted. Vision without resources forces innovation. Ideally, we'd have both, but if I must choose, I choose vision. He looked directly at her. You see, Ms. Leavitt, your first question, where did I go to school, revealed something far deeper, the belief that institutional prestige defines competence. Anderson Cooper leaned in. Can you elaborate? Gladly, Ibrahim said. Harvard is prestigious because it produces results, not the other way around. If a village school in Burkina Faso trains better engineers than Harvard, it deserves just as much honor. Prestige should follow performance, not shield mediocrity. Karoline tried to respond, but tradition, reputation, they matter. They do, Ibrahim said, in protecting the status quo, but innovation is born from challenging tradition, not worshiping it. His final words rang like a gavel. Education should create independent thinkers, not prestige repeaters. The studio remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Karoline Leavitt, once fiery, sarcastic, unshakable, was now still. Her eyes dropped. She took a breath, and then without warning she spoke, quietly. President Traore, I owe you an apology. The entire studio froze. Ibrahim blinked, genuinely surprised. "No apology is necessary," he said politely. "Yes," Karoline insisted, her voice trembling with humility. "It is. I came to this forum with deep prejudices about Africa, about your education system, about you. I assumed American superiority. I was completely wrong." Anderson Cooper could hardly believe what he was witnessing. "What changed your perspective, Ms. Leavitt?" "Every fact he presented shattered my assumptions," Karoline admitted. "I cannot argue with verified data. I cannot justify my ignorance anymore." Ibrahim leaned forward, speaking gently. "Admitting error takes courage. That courage is admirable." Karoline gave a weak, bitter laugh. "This is a well-deserved humiliation. I came here to expose weakness, and revealed my own." "Not weakness," Ibrahim said softly. "Growth." Karoline took another breath, then sat up straighter. "President Traore," she said firmly, "on behalf of the United States government, I would like to extend an official invitation. We request that you present Burkina Faso's educational model to our state secretaries of education." The studio erupted in quiet murmurs. Anderson looked visibly moved. "That's extraordinary." "It's necessary," Karoline replied. "If American universities are learning from him, so should our policymakers." Ibrahim nodded, the first genuine smile of the evening crossing his face. "It would be an honor." "There's more," Karoline said. "I propose an exchange program between American and Burkinabe educators. True two-way learning." Now Ibrahim looked genuinely touched. "Now you speak like an educator." The applause that followed was not explosive, but it was genuine, growing steadily. And as the forum closed, the entire world knew something extraordinary had happened. Not just a debate won, but a perspective transformed. 6 months after the forum that stunned the world, Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the tarmac at Ouagadougou International Airport. The former White House press secretary, once known for her rigid ideology and biting sarcasm, was now leading the third official American delegation of educators to study Burkina Faso's education system. "I never imagined I'd be here," she said during an exclusive interview with CNN. "But this country has lessons the world needs to hear." The education exchange program proposed during the CNN forum had exploded into a global movement. 23 countries had submitted formal requests for similar partnerships, hoping to replicate the revolutionary methods developed in this small West African nation. Inside the presidential palace, President Ibrahim Traore sat at his desk, surrounded by reports, proposals, and letters from universities around the world. Aminata Compaoré, his Minister of Education, entered with a folder full of fresh statistics. "Sir," she said with a proud smile, "we've now received 847 requests from international institutions to study our methods. Our educational influence has grown 500% since the forum." Ibrahim scanned the papers briefly and nodded. "The most important thing," he said, "is not the numbers. It's that educational cooperation is becoming mutual. America is improving its rural teaching strategies using our techniques, and we are advancing our research with their technology. This is what knowledge exchange should look like." Karoline had changed not just publicly, but deeply. At a keynote address at Harvard University, she stood before hundreds of students and said something no one expected from a former press secretary. "My initial ignorance was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous," she said. "I thought I knew everything because I represented power. But arrogance is the greatest barrier to learning." Ibrahim Traore didn't just change my opinion. He changed how I think. The audience gave her a standing ovation. Her book, Lessons from Burkina Faso, How Humility Transformed My Educational Vision, became an international bestseller. The foreword was written by none other than Ibrahim himself, who insisted that true progress must be shared, not owned. But the impact of the forum spread far beyond education. In diplomatic circles, it sparked new conversations about global assumptions. Development agencies began re-evaluating what aid meant and whether they had truly been listening to the nations they claimed to help. In boardrooms, corporations began exploring educational collaborations with African innovators, not as charity, but as intellectual partnership. In newsrooms, headlines shifted from "What can Africa learn from the West?" to "What is the West? Learning from Africa." And in classrooms across continents, teachers discussed Ibrahim's story as a case study not just of leadership, but of intellectual dignity. One quiet evening, Ibrahim walked through the palace gardens, joined by Ajara, his close advisor and oldest friend. The moon was high, casting silver reflections on the stone path. "You've changed how the world sees African education," Ajara said softly. Ibrahim paused beneath a blooming acacia tree. "I didn't change anything," he replied. Ajara tilted her head. "I just showed them a reality they refused to see. A truth that was always here, waiting for someone to look closely." She smiled. "And Karoline," she asked. "She proved something important," Ibrahim said. "That intelligent people can admit they're wrong, and that's more valuable than never being wrong at all." He looked up at the sky. "We don't win by shouting louder," he said. "We win by speaking truth until the silence finally listens." 6 months had passed since the televised forum that had stunned the world. In the dusty capital of Ouagadougou, the midday sun reflected off the tarmac as a diplomatic jet descended slowly onto the runway. The stairs lowered, and stepping into the African heat was a face the world had come to associate with tension, controversy, and now transformation. Karoline Leavitt. She was no longer the combative, dismissive White House press secretary. The lines on her face were softer, her eyes more thoughtful. This was her third visit to Burkina Faso, not as a skeptic, but as a student. A swarm of cameras clicked, but she didn't pose. Instead, she turned to greet a group of American educators behind her. They had come to observe, to learn, and in Karoline's words, to finally listen. CNN caught up with her on the steps of the Ministry of Education. "I never thought I'd be here," she said candidly. "I thought I had all the answers. Then I met a man who taught me that having a microphone doesn't mean you have wisdom." That man, of course, was President Ibrahim Traore. Across the city, Ibrahim sat in his presidential office, surrounded by proposals, reports, and global press clippings. Aminata Compere, Minister of Education, walked in with a folder nearly bursting at the seams. 847 universities, sir," she said with a gleam in her eye. "That's how many institutions have formally requested to study our education model. Some want to implement it. Some want joint research. Some want to send their ministers here to learn." Ibrahim barely looked up from the report in his hand. "Good," he said simply. Aminata tilted her head. "Just good." He smiled, then looked out the window. "I'm more interested in what this means for our students," he said. "Whether the children in our villages will have even better resources next year. Whether teachers will feel even more empowered. Whether learning will be a source of pride and not just survival." The news, however, was spreading far beyond Burkina Faso. The exchange program that Karoline had suggested during the forum had become a global model. 23 countries had officially signed agreements with Burkina Faso. A dozen more were in the negotiation process. The World Bank allocated new funding for reverse educational innovation, where developing countries would lead and wealthier nations would follow. At Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, elective courses titled the Burkina Faso Model began appearing on course lists. At the United Nations, an education resolution was passed that specifically cited the May 2025 forum as a turning point in international cooperation. And then there was Karoline's book. It was titled Lessons from Burkina Faso: How Humility Transformed My Educational Vision. The foreword had been written at her request by Ibrahim Traore. It became an instant bestseller, translated into 19 languages, taught in schools and universities, quoted in political debates. In her introduction, Karoline wrote, "I came into that room believing I was there to teach. I left knowing I was there to learn." She became a fierce advocate for cross-continental education partnerships. In Washington, she founded the Global Knowledge Exchange Initiative. In Burkina Faso, she helped fund libraries in rural communities. But beyond the policies, the programs, and the press coverage, what changed most was the story people told about Africa. It was no longer a story of helplessness, poverty, or charity. It was a story of innovation, dignity, and equality. And that change in narrative began affecting other sectors. Development agencies began shifting from donor-recipient frameworks to co-creation models. Tech companies in Silicon Valley began hiring more directly from African coding academies. Policy think tanks started including African educators on advisory boards, not as tokens but as equals. In classrooms around the world, teachers began using the CNN Forum as a case study in critical thinking, bias, and leadership. Children watched Ibrahim's quiet strength and Karoline's transformation and asked questions their textbooks never raised. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Sahel skyline, Ibrahim walked through the palace gardens. At his side was Ajara, his oldest friend and longtime advisor. The path was lined with orange trees in bloom. The air was still. There was peace in every step. "You did it," Ajara said softly. "You changed how the world sees us." Ibrahim stopped beneath a baobab tree and looked up at the stars, just starting to flicker in the darkening sky. "No," he said. "I didn't change anything." Ajara frowned. "What do you mean? I just revealed a truth that had always been there," Ibrahim replied. "A truth they refused to see until someone forced them to look." Ajara was quiet. "And Karoline?" she asked after a moment. "She proved something rare," Ibrahim said, his voice thoughtful. "That intelligence isn't knowing everything. It's knowing when you were wrong and choosing to grow." He took a deep breath. "We live in a world obsessed with victory," he continued. "But real power is not in winning arguments. It's in opening minds." They walked a little further in silence. Then Ibrahim spoke once more, almost to himself. "You don't defeat arrogance by matching it. You defeat it by being better than it. By letting the truth speak long enough that even silence starts to listen." The garden fell quiet again. But the world beyond it was listening still. The televised forum, featuring President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, did more than just challenge global assumptions. It redefined the dialogue on education, leadership, and humility. What began as a tense and skeptical interview evolved into a historic moment of intellectual realignment. This story presents multiple valuable lessons for individuals, institutions, and nations alike. President Traore faced open condescension, particularly from U.S. officials who doubted the legitimacy of an African leader's voice in global education reform. Rather than respond with anger, he remained composed, responding only with facts and evidence. His demeanor under pressure demonstrated that dignity, restraint, and calm conviction are more powerful than confrontation. The ability to respond with grace rather than emotion is a critical lesson in leadership. When challenged on the credibility of Burkina Faso's educational achievements, Traore countered with verifiable data. He presented literacy growth statistics, international endorsements, and collaboration requests from world-class institutions like Harvard and MIT. This revealed an essential truth. Prestige does not guarantee performance, and performance does not require prestige. Respect must be earned through outcomes, not inherited from tradition. Burkina Faso's rapid education reforms occurred despite limited resources. By leveraging mobile phones as teaching tools, building labs from recycled materials, and inspiring teachers with purpose over pay, the country proved that innovation thrives under constraint. Traoré's remark, "Vision without resources," forces innovation encapsulates a profound idea. When traditional tools are absent, creativity becomes a necessity. Perhaps the most transformative element of the forum was its challenge to the narrative that education innovation must come from the West. Traoré's evidence showed that Burkina Faso was not only improving literacy, but setting global standards in STEM education. He reminded the world that intelligence and capability are not dictated by geography, income, or institutional reputation. Karoline Leavitt, initially dismissive and skeptical, ultimately admitted her prejudice and ignorance. Her public apology and subsequent advocacy for educational cooperation signaled one of the most courageous acts in intellectual leadership: the willingness to grow. Her transformation underscored that intelligence is not just about knowing, it's about unlearning when necessary. The aftermath of the forum saw an explosion of educational exchange initiatives between Burkina Faso and dozens of countries. The shift from donor-recipient dynamics to collaborative partnerships highlighted a broader movement toward equity in knowledge sharing. As Traore stated, true education is mutual. We teach and we learn. Traore's final reflection that he did not change the world's perception of Africa, but simply revealed truths that had always existed, was a masterclass in humility. This attitude reminded viewers that leadership is not about demanding recognition, but about quietly working until the truth becomes undeniable. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from this story is that transformation begins not with shouting, but with speaking truth persistently and clearly. Traore's strategy was not to overpower with rhetoric, but to let data and results dismantle bias. His approach exemplifies the belief that persistent truth-telling, even in silence, can change the world. The forum was not merely a debate, it was a revelation. It demonstrated that educational excellence can arise from unexpected places, that humility can dismantle arrogance, and that true leadership is defined not by dominance but by the ability to inspire change. Burkina Faso's example is not just an African success story, it is a global call to reevaluate what we value in education leadership and learning. As a viewer watching the CNN Global Education Forum featuring President Ibrahim Traore, I expected a standard diplomatic exchange. What unfolded instead was a profound redefinition of global power, intellect, and dignity. It was not merely a televised debate, it was a moment that shattered assumptions and forced the world to pause and reflect. From the moment the discussion began, I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. President Traore entered the stage, not with flamboyance but with stillness. Surrounded by political skeptics from one of the world's most powerful governments, he sat quietly, calmly, and confidently. Many viewers like myself could immediately sense the tension. The tone was dismissive, especially from White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, whose condescending remarks reflected more than just political rivalry, they revealed deep-rooted prejudice. I watched as she questioned whether Burkina Faso had the legitimacy to contribute to global educational reform. She scoffed at the literacy rate, the infrastructure, and even went so far as to mock President Traore's academic background. It was uncomfortable, it was unfair, but it was also familiar, the kind of superiority often wielded without question by those who assume their country's wealth equals wisdom. Yet Traore did not flinch. He began to speak not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with facts. And in that moment, everything changed. As a viewer, I was stunned. He presented a compelling, data-driven account of Burkina Faso's educational progress, massive improvements in literacy, digital education across rural regions, technical universities built in underserved areas. More impressive still were the international validations from UNESCO, the World Bank, and even the U.S. Department of Education, when he revealed that institutions like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford were studying or adopting Burkina Faso's models. The studio's silence spoke volumes. It spoke of disbelief collapsing into reluctant respect. I remember feeling pride, not because I am Burkinabe, but because I was witnessing something truly just. It was a moment when truth dismantled arrogance and vision eclipsed power. What struck me even more was how President Traore didn't simply counter their points, he elevated the entire conversation. He didn't attack individuals, he attacked assumptions. When asked about his education, he didn't merely list degrees, he reframed the definition of intellect itself. He spoke 5 languages taught at prestigious American universities, and yet insisted that none of this made him superior. Instead, he argued that performance, not prestige, should be the true marker of value. For me, one of the most powerful statements came when he said, "If a village school in Burkina Faso trains better engineers than Harvard, that school deserves respect." That sentence resonated deeply. It wasn't just a defense of his country, it was a critique of the global tendency to worship tradition over merit. Karoline Leavitt's transformation was another unforgettable part of the broadcast. In the beginning, she was rigid, dismissive, and combative. But as Traore calmly dismantled her arguments, she began to listen. Her eventual apology, public and sincere, was more than surprising. It was redemptive. As a viewer, I admired her courage to admit she was wrong. That moment taught me that changing one's mind is not a weakness. It's a mark of true intelligence. When Karoline invited Traore to present Burkina Faso's model to U.S. policymakers, it felt like justice. Not symbolic justice, but concrete, meaningful recognition of competence that had long been overlooked. Beyond the studio, the story's aftermath was even more inspiring. The rise in education exchange programs, the international demand to study Burkina Faso's approach, and Karoline's published book all validated what President Traore had demonstrated on stage, that knowledge knows no borders, and that the world has much to learn from places it previously ignored. As a viewer, I found myself reflecting not only on international education, but on my own biases. How often had I unconsciously associated quality with wealth? How often had I overlooked innovation born out of necessity? The forum challenged me to reconsider what I thought I knew about global development. President Traoré's leadership reminded me of something rare in modern politics: quiet strength. He never raised his voice,